Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores church history and the church's truth claims. Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel, Mormonism with the Murph, where Larry Singh explores the church's history and the church's truth claims. And I'm joined again by Jerry Grover, who is a researcher and a geologist, an engineer as well, and he does a lot of work and research into the Book of Mormon. We've been doing a series on anachronisms in the Book of Mormon. In part one, we discussed Jaredite animals, and we also talked about other anachronisms and infant baptism as well, or the baptism of little children in Mesoamerica. And then part two, we discussed mostly animals and plants in the Book of Mormon in the Nephite and Lamanite time periods. And today we're going to be discussing metallurgy in the Book of Mormon. We've had some technical issues before. Jerry's internet connection hasn't been the best, so he's actually using his phone. But fingers crossed we can still do the episode and his audio and sound will be okay. But I'm going to operate the presentation. Anything you want to say before I load it up?
No. I thought we're going to start off just by a little update from the last time. There was a few questions
That'll be good.
On and just a little bit on wheat, and then go into the metals issues, the potential metal anachronisms.
Awesome. Okay, can you see the screen?
Yep, I can.
Okay.
So maybe go to the next screen. Yeah, one of the kind of the questions was there any loan sharing examples of plants? Because we had plenty of them on animals. And so this is one pretty good one where you have the Vikings who came over to what they called Vinland, which was North America. On one of the sagas, they sailed further south. I think it's either Massachusetts or maybe into New York. And they battled. They met some locals. They were friendly at first, then they fought them. But they actually said that they found wheat. That's what the saga actually calls it. And so clearly wasn't wheat. And so people have been trying to figure out what they were talking about. But also at the same time, they've also noted there were a lot of these situations with the early explorers where they just confused plants, the New World plants. They just called them wheat, barley, rye, peas, whatever was close.
Or like the name of something they're familiar with from the old world, from where they're from.
Right. And so this is a perfect example of where you have, another group coming in, they're encountering things. They don't really have, part of it is, well, if you live there long enough, maybe you pick up the name of whatever the locals call it or something, right? But when you're first arriving, you're just seeing something. You try to call it. Somebody asks what it is. You just try to call it something, right? So anyway, so it's just kind of saying it looks like most of the Book of Mormon, a lot of them are basically just loan shifting. And as we specifically said, they have to loan shift also because of their scriptures, their law of Moses, that they do have to call things certain things. They have to sacrifice a sheep. They have to have wheat offering and barley offering. So they got to call it that because that's what their scripture says. So,
and in Mesoamerica, maize or corn was a very commonly grown plant that they would have. And the Book of Mormon does mention corn as well, I believe.
Yeah, it does. Except actually, like in the Bible, corn can mean like any kind of grain. So it's almost, it's a reverse match. I don't know if you want to call it, meaning it may not even be corn that they're referring to in the Book of Mormon, because if you're looking at the King James Bible version translation and also like a loan shifting, if that was actually a word that they use, they may have actually used corn, maybe something different than corn. I don't know. So,
because your theory or hypothesis that you flushed out in the last episode is that the Nephites, when they came, they had the Bible, or at least the Old Testament, the breastplates with them, and that they're calling a lot of these plants and animals here in the New World names of those animals that you would find in the Old Testament. They're sort of given those names that we would see in the King James Bible.
Yeah, in fact, every single word, metals, plants, animals, they're all those words are in the Bible. So there's no other than like Ziph or Curulum, Cumulum, but so you basically do have the dependence on the Bible, and the explanation is double so in terms of loan shifting is that they cannot have in order to practice their religion, they have to follow the law of Moses. The law of Moses prescribes certain animals be sacrificed, right? So if you don't have a sheep, you have to. I mean, if there's not like if you didn't bring a sheep with you, you've got to find an equivalent of a sheep, right? So it has to be a clean animal to be able to be sacrificed. So that's all I'm saying is that's what's driving the naming. It's not just simply okay, like the Spanish arrived and they're like, okay, what do we call this? Well, the Nephites were doubly so required to find a name that was from their language because it had to be from their scriptural language. And then, as I pointed out too, there's all these metaphors and all these animals have certain associations, negative or positive, those kinds of things within their scriptures. So they do have to find an animal in order to even teach their law of Moses or read their scriptures. They have to have some equivalent that they assign. And you see that with serpent. Serpent has to. They have to have a serpent. I mean, there's serpents in the New World, but that would be an example. It's like, well, if there wasn't one, how do they even talk to this population who's not from the old world? And that's what Nephi said. He's like, he has to liken the scriptures to them somehow. Right.
So is this why you lean with this theory more so than it being a product of the translation and either the Lord or Joseph Smith, whoever you believe was the translator, that they're the ones who are inserting sort of this translation anachronism, but you're favoring more the theory that it was the Nephite authors who were doing this loan shift because if they're having to live and practice the law of Moses, there's certain animals or plants they need that are required in the law of Moses. So you find that more plausible than these all being a translator's anachronism. I think we talked about in the last episode in the book of Matthew, where King James Bible translators translated the passage about oil lamps to candlesticks, and that's an anachronism inserted by the translator. But in this case, you favor more that this is a loan shift by the ancient Nephi authors.
Yeah, I think there's both things going on in the sense that, we have some New Testament language, right? In the Book of Mormon, that's clearly a translator preference, right? To use that phraseology or, when Christ is teaching, some of it matches the Bible or the New Testament kind of almost exactly, a few little changes. So what I'm saying is the translator is not trying to recreate the Sermon on the Mount in some different, language structure, right? It's just saying, okay, here's what it is in the Bible where the translation is, as Skousen has shown pretty clearly, is very dependent on using the target language of the King James Version Bible, along with some early modern English, which kind of makes sense because it's kind of similar time frame, not exactly, but so there's two things potentially going on. There's your underlying loan shifting of the Nephites. I don't think the Jaredites did that. Their approach was basically the animals that are in English they brought with them. The other two, Curulum and Cumulum, are words they created for animals that they didn't that they encountered that they didn't have a name for. So they just constructed a name. Whereas the Nephites, they couldn't just construct a name. They had to have a sheep in order to do their Passover. And so they had to have an animal that was fairly widespread, number one, because that's practiced, they practice it in families, the Passover meal, that kind of thing. So it wasn't just some temple ordinance, right? So that's driving, in my opinion, the naming of and you see it kind of, as we said, they have wheat and barley, right? Those are named. Well, they had grain offerings. They had the barley offering and the wheat offering. So, I mean, you see it both in the animals and even in the plants. I think the same thing is happening in the metals to a certain extent, but it's not really driven so much. It wouldn't be driven by the law of Moses per se, but they're still using biblical. There's the Nephites anywhere using a biblical approach.
Okay.
So if you want to pop to the next screen just shows the the saga where this came from. Okay, so let's get on to the metals. Go to the next screen. I'm not going to deal with everything because there's actually a pretty good article came out by Matt Roper when he's looking at anachronisms. So, meaning this is such a broad area and topic and a lot of information. There's no reason to recreate. I'm just going to be adding to the ones where he did not show, where he found deficiency. I'm going to deal with those.
Okay.
So this would be new information not available. So it's not like a summary of other people's stuff. That's kind of what I try to do in my podcast, my research. It's not a regurgitation. It's new information that nobody would have seen now except for you. So
Very good. Well, I'll link that as well, his interpreter article on metals and metallurgy. It just came out, didn't it? 2025. I've not read that one.
yeah, just like a month ago, maybe.
Okay. I'll need to read up on that. That might be interesting.
Yeah, he has a whole series. They've come out chapter by chapter. So dealing with anachronisms. And so the chapter 3 was on metals. So basically what I've done here is just summarize kind of what his findings were. Basically, each of the metals listed. OW is old world, new world, yes, meaning there's evidence for those in the new world. And then the last row where it says the BM, Book of Mormon. Sorry, I probably shouldn't use that abbreviation. but so that would say, meaning, do we find it in Book of Mormon times? And so where it says no, and also the New World on steel, those are the things I'm going to deal with.
Hold on, so let me understand this right. He's saying that, for example, copper, old world, yes, new world, yes, but when it says Book of Mormon, no, he's not saying that it's not mentioned in the Book of Mormon. The no means it's not found during Book of Mormon times.
Yes, right. So this is what I consider unresolved anachronisms, if you want to call it that. So
I see.
Yeah, so you have, because I mean, some people have alleged, well, there wasn't steel like in the old world. Well, yes, there was, and it's been pretty well documented. So I'm not going to go back through all that. I'm not going to deal with every argument that people have made. I'm just saying, okay, what is the status of, and basically, I think he's established pretty well all these old world, all these in the new world, except for kind of thing, but they're still, have not been found archaeologically. And we'll talk about that, whether you would even expect to find them. That's something he doesn't really deal with.
Okay.
So let's go to the next slide. It's probably, we need to kind of talk about what is really indicated in the Book of Mormon from a metallurgy standpoint. Is there what level of smelting is even indicated in the Book of Mormon? When you have metallurgy, you can either have just native, that would be chunks of gold. You can have gold, for example, in a matrix, meaning there's chunks of gold, but it's surrounded by quartz, which you'll need to bust up and get that material out. Then there's what you call, and that's more or less called cold working, where you're just pounding and flattening and doing things with a softer metal. Or like with iron, if you're just polishing it or something, that's all cold working. Then you have different levels of hot working where you can heat it and it becomes more malleable.
Right.
When we call like really hot smelt, that means you're actually getting it hot enough so it's basically in a molten state. The other thing you have is complex smelting, meaning it's not just melting, it's you have the ore that's bound up in some chemical compound. So you actually have to break the compound to get the metal out of it. And that requires heating and oftentimes other chemicals. So, for example, iron, you have iron ore like rust. If you think of rust as an iron ore, it's got iron in it, but it's been oxidized, so it's combined with oxygen. So
right.
It's a different material. So you actually have to get that oxygen off of the iron. And so you heat it, and you also put in other materials like lime or some calcine, carbon too, if you're trying to take the oxygen off, it creates carbon dioxide. So there's different levels of smelting. So go to the next. slide.
I don't know if you have this on one of your slides, but is it sort of the scholarly consensus among archaeologists that while there might have been like metal ore, they don't believe that metallurgy and maybe this process of smelting was really done until what, AD 800, 900? Is that sort of the
Well,
consensus?
um, in Mexico, yes, and later somewhere in the Maya, there was that going on further south, like in Panama, Colombia, and so we're going to talk about that too, is because there's two sources of your metal, right? You're either getting it locally or you're trading for it, right?
Right.
So
Okay.
you have to look at both potential, and we'll kind of the text is again we don't have a ton of information in the text, right? So, but we do have to kind of imply a few things. So the other thing is what's really meant by ore in the Book of Mormon. So are we talking some complex ore? And the reality is no, they're just using the term ore the same way they're using metal. So that's an indication that we're probably not looking at high smelting for the most part. Um, Meaning there's no complex smelting going on. It's basically they're working the metal. They may be pounding it, they may be melting it, but it's not. They're not really having to change its chemical makeup or get it out of some complex um, chemical compound. Or like gold, meaning it's obviously now we produce gold with 0.02 ounces per ton. You can economically produce gold, so it's called disseminated or invisible gold. We're not talking about that. So it would be where they can actually see the gold and collect the gold. They may be doing it through placer. If you understand what a placer is, that's where they on the side of a river where they just go through the silt and there's little chunks of nuggets of gold that they get out. Or they're actually called high grade where there's maybe a vein of gold in a rock and they pound it out or chisel it out. Um, so the text itself is not indicative of what you call of complex smelting occurring the way that they are referring to it.
And
Okay,
do you believe as well, like obviously assuming if Nephi was an ancient historical figure and this is an ancient text, I've heard some scholars propose that Nephi, Lehi as well, might have been trained in metallurgical skill, which might explain both, the constructing of the ship at Bountiful, him needing metal from ore, and also here in the New World and creating the gold plates as well.
yeah, I think there's evidence of that. They had gold and silver with them that they got from their land. I mean, it may have been that they just had it, but typically they wouldn't necessarily. They seem to at least be familiar with the way to go until they got the Liahona, which down to the Saudi Arabia, which is where some of the mines are and stuff. So there's some kind of clues. The fact that he didn't have to like ask God about how to make bellows or anything like that tells you that he understood some metallurgy to a certain extent.
Yeah.
We'll
Because
talk.
do you get into, because some I've heard some apologists say that this may not have been a widespread practice of metallurgy. This might have been unique to Nephi or his community in the New World, even at the beginning where it talks about him finding metal ore and making swords after the manner of the sword of Laban. This might have just been at this particular time and this place, but it may not have been of widespread across Mesoamerica.
Yeah, we'll talk about that as we get down to that.
Okay.
You want to go to the next one? Kind of that.
Next slide.
Yes, you were had some foresight there. So
Sorry.
clearly, Nephi had some skill at working metals. I mentioned. However, it's a distinct possibility that this was not retained by later generations of authors, and because you don't really have anyone. It never says anyone made plates. Now there was ether that was separate. I'm just talking about the Nephite at this point. You had ether with some metal plates, but you don't have anybody. It doesn't say anybody. In fact, they weren't able to make them. Jerem said, "Well, it's too small to write on. I'll only write a little bit." And then Malachi said, "They're full. I can't write anymore." He didn't. He just said they're full. So they weren't making any new plates, and so there's two reasons for that potentially. Number one, they had no material, or number two, they had lost the ability to at least make that kind of gold plate.
Hmm.
because as we know, it could be Tembaga, it could have been gilded. So it did take a little higher level of metallurgical skill. So I'm just saying that does seem to be indicative from the text that there was at least some period of time where they either didn't have the material or they didn't have the technology. I do think it's probably the fact that the technology, because there are other times later where they said they had gold, but they don't say they're making plates or anything. Um, Again, the plates, the way we understand the plates, it's not just hammering something out. You either have to use depletion gilding of an alloy, which is called tembaga, or you can also get the same effect by um, gilding um, a copper plate, for example. But both of those are kind of higher metallurgical skills, right? So,
And
I
this
guess,
is specific, these mentions to the small plates, Jaram and Amaleki.
yeah, yeah, because he said they were rich in gold and silver, but he couldn't write on the plates because they're small, meaning he doesn't have room. So it's like, okay, he's got the gold and silver. It seems like they've that's what I'm saying. It seems like probably the gap is the technological capability of making the plate. Seems to have not carried on past Nephi.
Right.
Uh, that you'd say, well, why would that happen? It's like I don't really know. It may be that they, just Nephi knew how to do it and never like showed him how to make plates. He may have done other metallurgy, but and so
And during these Book of Mormon times in Mesoamerica, archaeologists don't find widespread skill of metallurgy, any evidence of them being skilled in metallurgy.
yeah. Well, we'll talk about that. What you would actually have to find, right? I mean, you don't. Let's just kind of move on. We'll answer those
Okay.
questions. So go to the next slide. Um, and kind of these are the issues need to be addressed when considering Book of Mormon metals. Translation, interpretation. We've talked a little bit about that, right? Meaning that when it says steel, what does that mean? What does that mean in the Bible? Uh, or if they're trying to, if the translator did it, or whether it's a lone shift initially. Um, then you've got the lone shifting. You also have reasons why the metals may not have been existent for archaeology to find, in modern times. We'll talk about Hebrew burial practices. I'm not going to talk I'm just going to mention soil and corrosion. I'm not going to have any slides on it. It's just the fact is in Mesoamerica, the volcanic soils, which is that most of what is out there, derived. There are there are some places where it's not, but those are very acidic. So, like in the Olmec, they have never even found bones of anybody in the Olmec because they're all dissolved, even in the burials where they're protected and everything.
And that's very common criticism we get about, the Book of Mormon final battles. Like if there are all these battles, surely we would find lots of skeleton or, weapons and things of those battles. And you're saying because of the acidic soils that they've not found any skeletons among the Olmec.
Yeah, I mean they'll last for a while, right? I mean, there'll be bones. It's not like they dissolve in like 2 days, but
Right.
over 100 years they, um, and actually in a strange way, it's interesting where they say, well, the bones laying there. I've got other in my Swords of Shule. I show actually the studies they have, forensic studies on bones. They degrade more because of the sunlight than anything else. So if they're covered in jungle, they actually will exist on the surface a little longer than if they're not. They're
Oh.
exposed to sunlight because the sunlight breaks down the bonds. So there is some, I'm not saying there is no recovery of skeletons and all that, but the reality is extensively there's just a lot of acidic soils. There's also a lot of precipitation, right? It's a tropical
Yeah.
environment. Water and metal don't mix, so you have corrosion. And that's the point I'm going to make is everything except for gold is subject to corrosion, and you would not expect them to survive thousands of years just laying in the soils or being exposed. That's why typically when they find things, maybe metals, they're either in arid environments like in Peru, or they're buried in such a protected way in some tomb where they don't get the soil activity and the precipitation doesn't access it as much. Um, then we kind of have to figure out, kind of how much metal is really indicated in the Book of Mormon, specifically where and which metal we're talking about. And we'll talk about the difficulty of even archaeologically locating metallurgical sites. Go to the next slide. We've already kind of talked about this, but just basically when we're interpreting these things, we need to look at the target language of the Book of Mormon, which we talked about. King James Bible version and early modern English.
Right. And one actually interesting example that I read about in Brandt's book is when it talks about the breaking of Nephi's steel bow. And that's what I never thought too much about, but it's like, yeah, how do you break a steel bow? And Brandt talked about in that book that likely it's borrowing or utilizing the steel bow language from the Bible, but actually in those times the Old Testament would have been like a wooden bow covered in like either bronze or brass. And then actually, if that's what it was, that would explain why when they got to like a more arid part of Arabia, why it would like twist and break. So some of these, although you could say steel bow is like a translator's anachronism, it actually makes sense recognizing that it's not actually like literally a steel bow, but that's a product of the translation.
Yeah. I do mention, we'll talk about it a little bit, but what I'll just bring it up now is that's why I think it is questionable whether Nephi had the ability to make steel because he wasn't able to repair his bow. So there's some question as to whether, so when it says he made, swords like after the manner of the sword of Laban, I'm saying there may be something different going on there. He's using another material that
Right.
looks to the steel. We'll talk about that. This is a new thing. So,
Okay.
Go to the next slide. Again, we're kind of talked about a lot of this, but and again, I just wanted to mention there's evidence of smelting in ancient Israel. So prior, and in Mesopotamia prior to 2500 BC. So there's no issue of old world stuff, right? The guys that came could have had a knowledge of that.
Right.
You're looking at metallurgy at the beginning of when they arrive or close to the beginning. That's not really an anachronism, and that's anachronism in the technological sense. Maybe an anachronism because nobody's found it yet in that particular location, but it's certainly not a capability issue.
Right.
Okay.
Similar to the claimed anachronism about writing on metal plates. Like we don't find much of that in the New World, but it is found in the Old World, so it's possible they could have carried that with them.
Yeah, and the reality was the way they're described. There's also the one-off issue, meaning the brass plates were not something normal. That's why they were in the treasury, carried them around to show off to people. This wasn't a standard because keeping records on metal plates is very not efficient. Meaning you have to smelt the metal. So if you're for business, people are not going to keep a bunch of metal plates. They're just doing it on papyrus or clay, whatever is convenient. You know what I'm saying? So
Yeah, people aren't walking around with their metal quad. It shows that they're held in high prestige.
yeah. So what I'm saying is just because it mentions something made of metal, you don't assume, oh, that's everything is using the metal. In fact, I kind of the point I'm making is when they say something is metal, they're pointing out that it's different, right? So the sword of Laban is different from the other swords that they have when they're wielding it. The swords that came with the Jaredite sacred bundle, meaning the one where they discovered multiple swords. Well, that was probably swords of Shule. Those were the unique, and we kind of know that because it says the breastplates were bright, but the swords were all lost their hilts and were rusted, right? So those are from different time periods. The breastplates were not. It wasn't picked up on a battlefield. That was a specific witness of the evidence that the Nephites were destroyed because their sacred relics were not with them anymore. That's what they thought, right? So what I'm saying is when they mention something is made of a specific metal, that maybe is a clue when you look at the overall text that that's more of an anomaly than a regular thing.
Okay.
So, okay. Also, there's just vagueness in ancient metallurgical terminology. Number one, you have historians. Most of them are not metallurgists, right? I would say Nephi, Mormon, and Moroni are the total exception. Most of them are just writing And so they're just relying on this material that somebody else told them it was or looks like. So they don't know the difference between, because you can have brass and bronze. Sometimes they look the same depending on the alloy mix. You can't expect the historian to necessarily know just by observation, or anybody that they're getting information from if they're not metallurgists.
Yeah, I couldn't tell the difference.
Right. So you have to say this is not a metallurgical, publication, right? It's history being, when they're mentioning it in the context of history, there's not an exactness in metallurgy. That's kind of all I'm saying.
Okay.
And then also the language itself. Let's go to the next one. I had just talking about Pliny. He was a historian, record keeper at the time, kind of the time of Christ, actually. And they call bronze. Sometimes it was brass. They translated as brass. They translated as bronze. Again, it was just kind of a catch-all term for various alloys of copper, and it was more dependent on what they look like than what the actual underlying alloy mix was. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
This is just an example of that, exactly what I just talked about. The other thing, you go to the next slide. The other thing is ancient metallurgy. They didn't even know the chemistry. Meaning there wasn't the knowledge of atoms and molecules and all that. So they just understood like recipe mixes. Does that make sense? So it was more like, okay, we've got some of this. And then ores are different depending on where you get them from in terms of like impurities and amounts of, like copper may have tin in it, or may have zinc. So sometimes it's quite dependent on the ore body that you're getting it from as to what the actual copper looks like. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So there's variation. I mean, even though they had recipes, it's not like now where we get pure copper, we mix it with pure zinc, or mix it with pure tin in some recipe where we can actually clarify. We know the purity of the metal, so it's a very specific process. Where for them, they're dealing with ore that's coming, stuff they've refined out of ore, which has different compositions depending on where you're at, the different ore body, and then they kind of mixing it. So it's not this exact science, is what I'm saying. So when you have this term, well, you have to say, well, the metallurgists maybe be calling it something, classifying it, but they couldn't break it down and say what percent was what.
Okay.
Then the other thing is, they called things. I just used the Muslim. This is just a quote. It's basically saying artists and artisans, basically the same metals and alloys as the Roman predecessors. They had gold, silver, alloys of copper, tin, lead, and iron. But exact information about it, because they just called everything like sulfur. They was just a word for bronze and brass. So they actually just said one term for two. So linguistically, you can't just, like some people say, oh, it's steel, so that just means it's such and such a percent iron, such and such a percent carbon. It's like, no, they didn't talk about things like that. If it looked like steel, had an edge or something close to steel, how would they know it was steel or not steel if they didn't make it?
Right. They couldn't exactly determine.
Right. So okay. Go to the next one. We'll talk about Jaredite metallurgy first. The way I'm going to do this is the Jaredite stuff, I'm going to go through metal by metal. The Nephite, I'm going to kind of go through chronologically. The metals mentioned in the book are either gold, silver, copper, brass, iron, and steel. So let's look at steel first. The first indication was of metallurgy in Jaredite record is relation to steel. But in ancient texts, I'm not talking Book of Mormon, I'm just talking the Old World, steel can refer to a range of iron products, including those with some carbon content. That's the definition of steel, is basically iron with carbon, either carbon surface. The language is that he molten it out of this hilt Ephraim. In another book I talk, if you want to pop to the next slide, in another book I talked about Ephraim, the Hebrew meaning for Ephraim means throw out things up in the air and stuff. So it sounds like a volcano of some sort is his heat source for what he's doing here. Because he says he had molten out and made swords out of steel. And it's the only time it's mentioned is steel. The other history, they just have swords. They just say swords. They're not like making some. What I'm saying is this seems to be one of those situations where they're describing it because it's anomalous, right? It's something. And so then the question is, why are steel swords manufactured at this point? And then how does it relate to the metallurgy?
Mm. Yeah, it isn't a clear, explicit mention to molting out of a hill, or like you said, possibly a volcano of some sort, swords of steel.
Yeah, and I think part of that, as I explained in another, I think I've done a podcast with you. Basically, that looks to be kind of almost a myth. It's not a myth, but it's a religious relic that the swords of Shule became. It's mythical in the sense that volcanoes in Mesoamerica are considered, sacred or spiritual, supernatural things, right? And so the fact that he had these swords, made out, and then we'll talk about too why I think they may have been also unique in their look and why they were called steel. But what's happening there probably is he had to flee. He's in the Tuxtlas. That's the way the mapping works out under the Sorenson model, or at least my version of the land northward. Sorenson didn't really do much with the land northward. Is it looks to be in the Tuxtlas where there actually is no obsidian there. So he formulates, is utilizing an iron of some sort to make these swords, because that's really all that he has available to him. So he had to make, these types of swords. It's just because if he had to, because there was no obsidian. He didn't have, their normal swords were made of obsidian edged wood, So, and these are I basically asserted elsewhere that it looks like these.
I'm just going to pause the recording. Okay, we're back after a little technical difficulty there. Okay.
Am I looking okay on the camera here? I can't tell.
Yeah, no, you look fine.
Okay. Yeah, kind of as we were discussing, the Shule kind of made these swords because he had to, because he didn't have obsidian available in the area where he was at. And then these were passed down, the swords of Shule, because they had, they're obviously some significance. They're of this metal, that something special about it. We'll talk about that.
When you refer to obsidian swords, are you referring to the ones with the wooden clubs with obsidian edges, the maquatil, or how it's pronounced?
I mean, they may not have had that's the Aztec form of them, but they may have had shorter swords, or they may have made them differently, but they were using obsidian.
Okay.
In some form or fashion. There are some that even look like they had like what's complete obsidian little blade, like dagger things, that they maybe were able to smooth the surface so they had a handle of some sort. We don't really, it's just kind of you're looking at some murals or depictions way back in the old day where there's some kind of curved sword or something, like a scimitar. If you want to go to the next screen, it's just kind of showing where the Tuxtla Mountains are. That's the area of the Olmec which we're talking about for the most part, kind of the heartland of the Olmec.
North of the isthmus, northwest.
Yeah, well, the isthmus, where you see the La Venta, the isthmus is right there. So it's where the part of the start of the word La Venta, that's kind of the isthmus, the narrowest point of the isthmus. So, but it's the north side of the isthmus of Tehuantepec. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, you can go to the next screen. Like I said, there's no other mention made of rust in the Book of Mormon. Again, so there's something unique about these swords. In the Book of Mormon, this sort of Laban was made of fine steel, right? So you have, I'm not saying they're the same, but you actually have meaning the the technology to make the steel, because Shule was what 2 or 3 generations removed, may have existed. I'm not sure that it did. It was what he did was make steel. I think there's another explanation which we're going to talk about. Similar, Nephi also had, this had fine steel, recognized fine steel, may have had the capability. The sword of Laban actually was passed down and maintained as a sacred ancestral object among the Nephites, as we know. I'm saying the same thing seems to have happened with the swords of Shule.
And steel swords in Jerusalem, that's been attested in recent decades because I believe, if I'm not incorrect, that when the Book of Mormon first was released, steel swords, even in Jerusalem, was considered anachronistic.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know how long ago they were calling it that, but it's been known for a long time, decades at least.
Yeah. But no, it's attested.
Right. And then the interesting thing is steel is not mentioned past the sword of Shule. When it's mentioned that the Jaredites have such and such metals, steel is never mentioned again. So it seems to be a one-off kind of thing, right? If it was actual steel he was making, the technology doesn't seem to have been passed on. And then I have another proposal that it's probably meteoric iron that he's using, because it's harder than regular iron. It has, and we'll talk about it. It has features that look the same as a what Nephi would have called fine steel. So let's go to the next one.
Can I offer maybe just a quick, I've just thought like of a critical pushback of what if a critic might say that, so early in, the Ether record of the Jaredites, it mentions, steel swords, but the author wouldn't necessarily have to repeat that the swords are steel every time for them to still be steel. So even if it doesn't say every time swords of steel, they could still be referring to steel swords.
Well, if that was like the first and only, but like they had swords before that too, meaning the mentioning, you may make that argument with Nephi, but the Jaredites, I believe, talks about warfare, fighting before that. So, and there's something, again, it's not, you can assert that, but I don't know what textual evidence you've got to assert that. Meaning, it's one thing if they're saying, hey, here's exactly how the swords are made and made forever. That's not that kind of record. It's just mentioning them for whatever reason. Why is Moroni even caring about these things, right? Because he inserts this story, which doesn't add anything much to the text. So it's like pointing. You can actually look at the text and say, I think we can figure out that's likely what it was. I mean, what I'm saying is the text does not indicate that these swords were picked up off of a battlefield. The text indicates the opposite of that. It's a testimony, it's a witness, it's their sacred records, all of that. So the question is, I'm not trying to say it was or it wasn't in terms of like they had no other steelmaking capability. I just know it seems like that story has features of it that seem to be of a religious nature, right? Hill of Ephraim, these kinds of things. There's something about that story that is something unique in the history. But again, like I say, I don't necessarily do my research just to, wander through the minds of critics and all their creative thinking. I just got to go to the text, what the text indicates, look at the archaeology, what we know, and see how it fits, and the science, what we know, see how it fits. And also, you look at the things like loan shifting, how ancient texts were actually constructed and written.
Okay.
You want to pop to the next. The interesting thing is one of the etymologies for the name Shule is a Sumerian word shilu, which means a metal. So I think maybe his name is even derived from that incident where he created the sword. So
Well, that's interesting.
And when it says the language, next screen, it says when it says molten out of a hill, that doesn't imply mining it, right? It doesn't say mined it. It says it's something different, like molten out of the hill. So I basically say it seems like he's using. My proposal would be that what makes the most sense is, although he may have had the capability of making steel itself or iron, I think he's probably using a meteoric iron, which um, this is known all over the world that ancient peoples use that. Basically, iron comes down right as a meteor. It typically is a nickel, it's a iron nickel alloy as opposed to iron carbon alloy, but it can get a sharp edge. It's more brittle, um, but it's a stronger weapon than, let's say, obsidian would be in terms of strength. Now, obsidian is very sharp. That's one of the things you look at is you say you have to look at the availability of metal, all these kinds of things. If you've got these citizen armies in Mesoamerica who are just kind of called up, Moroni goes around with a flag, hey, come join the fight. Well, it's pretty hard to go, and metallurgy is very intensive. You got to mine it, you got to produce all these kinds of things. It's much easier for like a small village. Obsidian is ubiquitous. They're already using it for tools and everything. It's not very hard to make an obsidian weapon. And it's a superior weapon in the sense that it's sharper than metal. Now, it's not as strong, the strength of it. And then a steel sword can knock off, can break the obsidian. So, and that's kind of what I propose with Ammon. I have a different video out with Word Radio where I show that probably they weren't chopping the arms of people off. He was disabling their weapons or cut their weapons in half, that kind of thing, their clubs. So it's just our interpretation of arms is incorrect there. But anyway, that's a whole other video. But
is that referring to Ammon?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So you don't see it as he's using the maquetale, the wood with the obsidian. He's not actually slicing off their arms.
No, I'm saying he probably either because he was one of the rightful heirs to the sword of Laban, or, and we'll talk about this, I do think that Nephi, when it says he made them after the type, he was using a meteoric iron that was available. That's what they were calling steel. So it says in the manner I'm not sure he could make. The proposal is it's Damascus steel that the sword of Laban is, right? So it's very fine steel. It's some different kind. We'll talk about it. So what I'm saying is he had a superior weapon, right? And so when he battled the guys with it, just number one, the story doesn't make a lot of sense, and meaning, okay, he went and cut their arms off and then they ran away. All right, this isn't Monty Python, right? They would just die. You can't go with your arms cut off and just start running around, right? And then they came back later to when he was collapsed, or unconscious, to rebuke them. Says they came, those people came that he had scattered. So, and it says he only killed 7, 6 with the sling and 1 with the sword. So none of those people died. It just, to me, it never made sense, even as a kid. I just thought this story doesn't make sense. And so what I'm saying is, yeah, they basically broke their weapons as he smote them with his arm. His arm was not, it was not his arm. It was his weapon. His weapon was superior.
Kind of like when we say laid on your arm. So you interpret it as when he smote their arms, it's referring to the weapon.
Almost all the other references to arm in the Book of Mormon are weapons. They're not the actual arms of people.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and when they battled the king, it says that he lost the strength of his arm, and he knocked the obsidian off it. He wasn't just like sitting there with his arm, meaning and so in Mesoamerica, the arm itself, the weapon itself, is considered. That's the other thing is like, why would they think he's a great spirit or whatever, right? Okay, so he battled some people, cut their arms off, all right, but the weapon itself is a manifestation of a god. That's the way they look at it. So it could be particular weapons, axes or playlock and all that. So the fact that his weapon was to them magical, and it looked, and we'll kind of show that, it looks like meteoric iron, which they considered sacred. They're gods based on meteors, right? That because the Aztec had swords made of meteoric iron. Most people don't realize that. daggers and swords. So they did have hardened type weapons. So I'm kind of saying the story fits more in Mesoamerica if you kind of understand the underlying culture as to why they thought, my gosh, this guy's something totally, he's like a god, right? They thought he was the Great Spirit. Well, the Great Spirit's the Nephite God. If you read it closely, it says, the Nephite God has saved them. It helped them through their Nephite gods, killed all these Lamanites. So and they knew he was a king anyway, right? I mean, he wasn't treated like the rest of the missionaries. He was let go. He was offered a daughter, so they knew he had some nobility. And kings themselves also have divinity, right? Meaning they're considered gods on earth, that kind of thing.
It's interesting you proposed that it likely could have been an actual metal or steel sword, like the sword of Laban that Ammon might have had. Because I think, if I'm remembering in the text, that some of them also come to Ammon with their clubs. So it does seem to distinguish between their clubs and Ammon's sword.
Yeah, it says they came with their clubs, and then it says they raised their arms. People says, "Oh, they raised their arms." It's like, well, no, they raised the clubs. I mean, they said what they were, and then the king, the father of King Lamoni, he used a sword, right? So, and then it said he smote on Ammon a bunch, and then it said the strength of his arm was lost. Well, that's just saying that. Well, yeah, because he had an obsidian type weapon, not a club, and probably stronger, but still knocked the. It says with the edge of his sword, he defended himself. I mean, he knocked the edges off. So, for me, I look at that. You could interpret it the other way. I'm not saying that people, but it just makes way more sense. And also in a Mesoamerican context, you can understand what's actually going on with them, why they're perceiving him as such, because he's got this weapon that has destroyed the weapons of all these people. Smote off their arms. I mean that just means he knocked their. They strapped their clubs onto their wrists, so it could have been that they, disarmed them, or it could have been that he just actually cut right through their weapons, their clubs, because he had a sharp edged. And in fact, that's what when the conquistadors came, the Aztecs said the worst thing. Yes, they had horses, they had some armor, but they could actually puncture their armor with certain spears. But they really feared the broadsword because it was able to just knock the obsidian or bust their macahuitls. So we already know that from practice of actual combat with both the types of weapons.
Right, yeah,
So
the steel sword would have been superior.
right now, it's not necessarily as sharp. The obsidian's sharper. It's like surgical, but the edge is brittle. So yeah, in a battle with uh, a steel sword, the steel will break the obsidian, right? So
Well, that's
anyway,
interesting. That's kind of sad, though. I always like reading the story that he's actually slicing literally off their arms, but that could be a correct interpretation. That's interesting.
yeah, that's what I said. It's kind of going to. I've got a lot of pushback, but mostly from people that wrote the comic books. The Book of Mormon comic books.
Yeah, the picture books, the Book of Mormon stories with the arms being cut off. You can't take
Yeah,
that away from us, Jerry.
I'm sorry. It just doesn't make a lot of sense. I mean, it's not the alternate explanation is more practical. Actually matches the culture. You can see the culture. What was going on with the culture, um, and just from a physiological standpoint, you can't cut somebody's arms off without them dying shortly. I mean, you know what I'm saying? It's
Yeah,
not like
that's a good point.
the Black Knight and Monty Python, where he's still running around trying to bite people with no arms. So that's why Monty Python's funny, right? Because it's not really feasible. Okay, let's pop to the next one. I just mentioning there are two ways to make steel. Um, Steeling of iron, you can quench it and carburize it through taking heated iron, hammering the iron, and folding it so carbon molecules from the charcoals get beaten into the iron. Because you're trying to. So the question is, there are different ways of getting a steel edge. One is you actually make it with steel, where you have a bath of molten iron and you're adding carbon into the bath. You know what I'm saying? And it's incorporating the carbon into the alloy structure. Or you can carburize the surface of it to make a steel surface or a cutting edge. And there were different techniques, but even like in the American colonial times, they would rub it with tallow, heat it, reheat it, pound it, so they could add carbon that way. And I'm just saying a reasonable. So you can interpret probably two ways of Shule. Number one, maybe he had steel making capability that he, was passed down to him. I tend to think probably it was more this meteoric iron um, that was being used because it's not mentioned. When I say not mentioned, not necessarily mentioned as sword, it's in their list of metals that they were working later on. They don't mention it. It is kind of rare, meaning these meteoric iron is rare, meaning they have to find it and it has to be collected. But it's not a known, is all I'm saying. But you wouldn't use meteoric iron to try to arm an entire army. You wouldn't have enough of it.
So that's what you're proposing is the steel among the Jaredites is meteoric iron.
I'm
And
saying it could be either, but I'm the reason I'm saying that is because I think when they saw the the Limhite expedition, thought these were the sword of Laban or the type of the sword of Laban, because you have these sacred relics, right? You have this uh, breastplates, copper and brass, super shiny. We'll talk about it. Then you have which actually match divinatory breastplates that the Olmecs wore, uh, the kings or whatever. And then you had this record, right, of gold, some kind of gold record, and then you had these swords. So and that was the reason that they thought the Nephites were gone. Now, Limhi didn't quite believe it, probably because he had some knowledge of like the language didn't match or something. But I do think maybe the swords. One reason they thought those were Nephite swords because they had some similar look to the sword of Laban. Okay,
okay.
it's a little bit of conjecture, but it does actually somehow they have to believe that this was a sacred bundle of the Nephites that was lost because they were totally destroyed somehow, right? Because that's what it says. It's a testimony that they're wiped out. That's what they thought.
Alrighty.
So a lot of people have brought up. Maybe you've had people on your website or podcast as well, but I like the candidate for. If you want to go to the next screen, um, I like the candidate for the most precious steel used in the sword of Laban is Damascus steel. Okay, and that's made with the folding. It's a specific technique that gives you this really funky design or pattern on it. And I think maybe that's what when Nephi's saying it's in a fine steel. It wasn't just it's something different, right? Um, then if you want to go to the next frame, this is what looks like when you make it out of meteoric iron. If you look at the design on that um, blade, it's similar to the Damascus steel. So what I'm kind of saying is I think the look of the swords of Shule maybe had a little bit of look like the sword of Laban. Then I'm also kind of saying this may be again. I'm looking at possibilities. You could have Nephi making some sort of steel if he had the capability to make steel. I'm not sure he did because you don't have to have steel to make iron tools, right? I'm not even sure they were iron, to be honest with you. But so you you could have had it being made, or you could look at this meteoric iron is what they called steel because it looked like sort of Laban. It had the same look. It had an edge. It could sharpen, right? It was an alloy. It just wasn't a carbon alloy. It was a nickel alloy.
Okay.
So I'm just saying that there are two possibilities you could consider, right? And we do know that's what I'm saying that even though you haven't found any archaeologically, uh, number one because it degrades, right? Iron doesn't stay rusts away. It's just left in the soil or disposed of in that kind of environment. So I'm not saying you would necessarily, but we do. There's a pretty good evidence that there was meteoric iron we haven't found meteoric iron, but they found it with the Aztecs. They collected it. It's found other places anciently. Ancient peoples used it in this
So,
way.
so you're proposing that as a possibility for the steel being referred to in the Book of Mormon being this meteoric uh, iron that might have somewhat of a similar appearance, perhaps?
Yeah, appearance, and it's also harder. It's not like iron. It's an iron alloy that is harder. It's not as hard as steel, but it takes an edge. It's a little more brittle, but it's a little harder to work. But you can make a very suitable sharp sword with it, right? And again, kind of going, it actually looks like what maybe this sword of Laban looked like. So uh, I'm just saying it's possible Nephi had steel making, but I'm saying even if he didn't, this is a viable alternative archaeologically and culturally that was available to both the Jaredites and the Nephites.
Mm, okay.
Um, so that kind of takes care of the steel, the Jaredite steel. Um, uh, Again, we mentioned he's only a few generations removed, so you're not going to get probably any steel in the archaeological record. It doesn't matter where you. It doesn't matter. It's not really the location. I mean, it's just you're not going to expect that, right? Iron doesn't survive very long. Doesn't survive modernly very long. Okay, so let's go to the
Especially in the environment, acidic soils and all the rainfall as well will
yeah,
contribute to it not lasting very long.
yeah, especially the Olmec area. So, to say nothing of a bunch of volcanic eruptions that cover everything up.
All right, yeah. Okay.
Okay, let's get to Jaredite brass. Okay, in the old world, when you deal with the ornamental metals, which seems to be what they're primarily using, the Jaredites don't talk about making tools. It's mostly decorative kind of things. Um, you're basically just trying to get a particular finish. And like I mentioned before, is you don't have to. They weren't necessarily classifying it by some chemical alloy um, lab result they had gone through. They're just looking at it and the way they could use it. Oftentimes, is what they would call brass. Uh, so in Ether 1023, it says they worked in all manner of oil, or it did say that they did cast up mighty heaps of earth to get ore of gold, silver, and copper. They didn't say they did that for brass. So some might argue perhaps that, well, that means, okay, that must be an alloy they were making out of the um, copper
Mm.
and um, zinc. So, but there's another explanation, and that is simply that they didn't have to mine it because it was available by trade to them. It wasn't there in their area. And if you look at, um, go to the next slide. So if you're looking at the Jaredite history from where they came from, uh, there was no known Sumerian word for brass. Um, the bronze there was, which is your copper tin, your brass is your copper zinc. But brass was known. They know that they found it in the areas, so it wasn't. Uh, so when they say that the Sumerian, meaning the issue of brass being a word that they might have had, I think it's probably likely they did, or it was just thrown into the classification of bronze or something like that. And what I'm kind of asserting, want to go to the next. Just I'm going to the Bible a little bit here. It's a little bit early. We're not talking about Nephite stuff, but it does kind of tie in. Is that you did have a term in the biblical Hebrew that also was interchangeably used for brass or bronze. So you don't necessarily look to, okay, it was some chemical. They knew the difference. It was more of the look of it, right? Uh, and then I mentioned that the definition for bronze in Sumerian is interesting. This is a bar. The word also means arrowhead, weapon, metal mirror, or a metal bowl, shiny, bright, and pure. So, and go to the next one. Kind of my proposal is probably what they're calling brass is not necessarily the alloy. It's really pyrite, which is extensively used by the Olmecs in manufacturing their mirrors, their shiny mirrors, and their bowls and their breastplates, actually. And as you can see, you have brass cubes. I mean, the look is not all that different, right, in appearance. If you want to, as I mentioned, there's necessarily not a necessary need to dig up heaps of earth like you would for gold and silver and copper, which incidentally probably tells you there's not a ton of it in the Olmec area to begin with, that they're having to really dig up so much stuff to get a little bit of their metal. If you want to pop to the next one, pyrite crystals often form in surface deposits. You don't have to mine to get them. You want to go to the
That's cool.
next screen. It's just more likely the pyrite was a trade item not available in the Olmec area. In fact, we know that where the pyrite is found in Mesoamerica and traded anciently. So that actually matches the archaeology that we know in the sense that we do find some pyrite traces. I mean, they're corroded, but there are some mirrors that they have. You can still see a little coating of pyrite on, that kind of thing. So it has survived, at least. And what they did is they would take iron oxide and polish it, and then they would also put pyrite on it. The iron oxide is so this is, as I mentioned, pyrite seems to, was used by the Olmec to make these mirrors. Now, this one isn't a particular pyrite one. Most of them have corrosion, so they're not really that shiny anymore. But they did make these mirrors concave. They made breastplates that were concave, which is incidentally the way that the breastplate was described that came with the plates and the interpreters. Was it was concave, so it was similar. I do think that's really what you're looking at. It's a Mesoamerican style breastplate. It's a divinatory breastplate. I mean, they would use these because they gave you really funky. You could see, look like they're trying to show it looks like a hand is coming out of it because it gives you a different focal point if it's concave. And they could light fires with it, and then they could, they would wear them in battle, like the king, give them special power, that kind of thing. They had superstitious elements related to it. So that's kind of a brass, kind of my take on brass, that it's really probably talking about pyrite. I mean, again, it's not going to survive. If they really could make brass, it's not going to survive archaeologically, likely. But I think this is, from an archaeological standpoint, also because of the nature of the lone shifting and just the look of the material, it looks like brass. So,
okay,
same color.
So you're saying it could have been pyrite, which is something similar, at least in appearance, to brass.
Yeah, which we know was present archaeologically. So, which they did work, because it says they worked the brass. They worked with all metals and stuff. So, it's consistent.
And this is specific to the Jaredites, during the Olmec civilization.
Yeah, they did have it was present later too, but the Olmec are specifically known for making these funky things out of pyrite. The others had it as well. So
okay, don't we go to the next slide?
Yeah. So now we're talking about copper. So pre-Columbian copper work is known, but not yet discovered in the record of the Olmec during Olmec times. Really, the point of this slide is just basically to say that there was copper present in the area, also some gold, meaning I'm not saying it was mined then, but I mean, we have evidence of the mining, but at least was not an unknown material that they could have had. So when you're looking at anachronisms, you have to first say, okay, was the material available? Um, as I said with pyrite, it was clearly a trade item. We have record of that trade. We know that because they've sampled the pyrite, so they know it was traded from those outside, kind of outside the Olmec area on the margins. Copper, we know, was present. We have some modern mining or mines. The other thing you don't think about is with ore, you're not necessarily going to find the mine because sometimes they mined it out, right? So it's not like it was being continuously mined. And that may be one reason when you're looking at a metal through time, it's just like if you go to the state of Nevada, there are ghost towns all over the place. Well, what happened? They mined it and then it was mined out, right? So they mined it for 40 years and then it exhausted the ore. So they were gone. It's just a ghost town. So you may have periods where, oh, they actually had it, they mined it, and then it's like, well, we don't have any more. We don't know who to go to get more. So that can limit. That's why when you're looking through the archaeological record, you can't necessarily assume, oh, okay, they had it, in 1000 BC, so they must have had it in 600 BC, right?
Right.
Yeah, you don't. That's an assumption that I don't think is a very. I think the historical record indicates it's just the opposite, unless it's a really large, massive deposit, which gets mined for a long period of time. These smaller, especially like placer deposits, they get exhausted. So,
Okay. Do you want me to go next slide?
yeah. And silver is the same. I didn't put a title on it, but it is available. There's one silver mine, not kind of in the Olmec area, the current silver mine. So, but again, it's not going to survive. It's not being expected to survive in those types of soils in every situation. So, again, do we have evidence? It's like I don't know if I would expect evidence of something from 1000 BC.
Hmm.
And like may only existed for a period of time. In some ways, almost the text you indicate they kind of talk about, oh, there was this great thing, great city, and all these great things happening, but well, it didn't last for very long. And part of it is, well, maybe they didn't have everything available forever. They kind of mined stuff out, and then it was no longer. They didn't have another source.
So in this case, it could be, absence of evidence may not be evidence of absence when it comes to some of these metals in Olmec or Jaredite times. Do most archaeologists, do they just presume there wouldn't have been any metallurgy, even though they acknowledged it might not have like made its way through?
Yeah,
Um,
we'll talk about what you would expect in terms of archaeological evidence. And specifically when it comes to gold, talk about that. But
okay.
the point I'm making is you cannot assume, basically, what we know from mining. Yes, there are some deposits that get mined for a long, long period of time. They just have a very large deposit. But if you're looking at smaller deposits, they will get mined out, and the material is no longer available, right? The other thing that's happening is you always have these wars and things. Populations are moving, so they may have actually got moved to an area where they no longer have access to it, right? So there's reasons that you cannot, just because it mentions it in 1000 BC, you cannot assume that, oh, we're going to expect metals all the way till 400 BC when the Jaredites ended, or that it pre-existed very long. They may have just found the deposit and then worked it. Does that make
Right,
sense?
got you.
Yeah, so the metals are not necessarily this constant. It's not like growing, corn, right?
Yeah, there's
It's
prevalent throughout the whole time, and there's metallurgy that's widespread. We can't have that assumption.
yeah, and so if your source material gets exhausted or is gone, you can very easily lose the technology over time.
Mm.
You may have some residual pieces of it or something, but there's nobody going to make any money if there's no ore to be. I mean, they're not the guild, the craftsmen are not going to be maintained, right? After a generation or so, they're gone because it's like, why would they care to know it? It's not profitable. They don't have any ore to work. So,
Okay.
so I'm just saying that there is something little different about metals that you have to consider the source material. Um, that it's not everywhere; it's only in certain locations, and it doesn't necessarily last forever. Okay, let's go to the Jaredite gold. Now, gold would not be expected to be degraded from acidic soils or precipitation, right? But it has not been found in the Olmec area um, in the right time frames that we that the Jaredites are mentioned that it occurred, right? So, um, and so then why don't we look? There's since it's not there. I mean, this you could say, well, that means um, that's some proof that that record is not correct, is false or created or something like that, created by Joseph Smith. But number one, there are examples where we have a known metal um, that actually had a gold in it. What was described that was described by Pliny and Josephus and others, even up into the 10th century AD, called Corinthian bronze. You want to flip to the next screen. So this Corinthian bronze has been documented in text and everything, but no one's ever found any of it. So it's not always, you can't always just assume that it's going to be found, right? There's other, if you want to go to the next one, again, we're not going to read it at all, but same thing happened where we actually have like a whole treasure trove described of gold objects and everything in about 1100 AD. They're totally gone, disappeared, right? we don't have, we don't have them anymore, and no one has them. So it's kind of like there's a lot of things that we have historical records of that we have no archaeological examples of.
Right. So it's not just that this is occurring when it comes to the Book of Mormon, but throughout other parts of the world or other ancient known texts that there's historical references to some metals, but there isn't the archaeology to corroborate it.
Right. I'm not saying that like, okay, that explains. I'm just saying it's not quite as clear as people want to make it out to be. That, oh, we ought to just be able to find it. Um, the other thing, and then let me go to the next screen. That's the second paragraph. It's and that was what your question of the mines and all that. In Colombia, well, for example, the mine. Let's go for the archaeology itself. The mines themselves are not usually in the middle of a city, right? Even now, they're clear up in some mountain somewhere, right? Because you got to go where the material is found. The other thing is um, the smelting, the metalworking often occurs near the mine. They don't necessarily, because it's not efficient to transport all this ore that they then have to pound the stuff out of. And that's why you have like ghost towns. Probably Ireland doesn't have it, I don't know, but like in the United States, like in Utah, Nevada, they would get the mine, they would set up the smelting located next to the mine. You don't have to do that, but that's what would typically happen. And in Colombia, we have all of these gold pieces, but they've never found where the smelting or workshops were. So here's an example where they actually have found the gold, but they're not able to find. Also, it's in the jungle. You know what I'm saying? It gets covered up. The other thing that happens is, in terms of ancient work, and go to the next screen um, is one reason you don't find them is because the European invaders and mining companies came in and prospected for metal ore and in the same places the local people were and just excavated it all out. So you don't have any evidence of their mining because it's already the material, even the whole town is gone because it got mined out. Does that make sense? So and they don't care to document that there was some ancient mine there, right? So that's when it's talking about this finding actual smelting and workshop sites. That is not, that's much more difficult than people think. Is most archaeologists, a lot of times they don't find those.
Mm.
Now they found a few because like Mexico, they go up on the top of the mountain for their furnaces because they get wind. They use wind to augment their because they didn't really have bellows; they had a pipe, and so okay, we know that for them. So they would look on top of mountains or something. Maybe they would find something, but that's not really the case. In a lot of these situations. The other thing that happens, um, go to the next screen. Uh, is that there's a lack of archaeological evidence of precious metals in Mesopotamia, as the historical texts indicate the metals were often rigorously controlled by the bureaucracy and were regularly recycled. All right. So they just weren't thrown out. They were, because they were considered valuable, they were not what you'd find in a garbage dump next to a city, right? And in Camino Junior, we don't have the metals, but we show that the actual monuments are being recycled. The stone is being recycled. So it's a practice that's known. The other thing that happens, especially in Mesoamerica, you have plundering and looting, and not just now. It's happened all through time, right? So you typically have. It was interesting when they did the lidar in the recent lidar in Mesoamerica. It was funny because I was watching a show. There's we found this new, look like a little pyramid or something, clear out in the jungle where they didn't know. And they get out there, it's already been looted. So archaeologists had no idea what was there, but the looters had found it.
Right.
So,
Was it different
uh,
metals that they took from it?
well, they were taking jade or anything. They could market all kinds of, even the pottery, and so it wasn't necessarily metals. And there weren't really much metals. And that's another thing that we need to talk about is we'll do it on the next slide. Um, the other thing that happened, like anciently, often when they would conquer somebody, they'd take everything, right? So maybe if the Nephites had it, they got conquered. They just went and took everything they had, burn the city and take anything of value. Yeah, is
I guess metals would be
and that's
seen
not
as
unique
quite
to Mesoamerica. That's
precious,
just
wouldn't
every
it?
place. Well, yeah, if that culture cared about them, yeah. And I'm just saying they would take anything of value. That's why they did warfare, right? I mean, Ireland should know about that with the Vikings. They didn't come and they came for a purpose. Plundering was one of the kind of the main things the Vikings did. That's
Yeah.
why the churches would hide all their stuff and everything. So I'm just saying that anciently you had all this going on. So that culture may have had some, but then it got plundered, right? And then the other thing is archaeology itself is mostly excavating temples, graves, those kinds of things. Um, and so they're probably finding, if they find gold, for example, well, that doesn't mean gold is being used among all the people. It was just an elite item. And the reason they were able to find it is because it was actually in a temple, which they are interested in excavating archaeologically, right? So I'm just saying that if the culture didn't have that practice, like the Nephites didn't have kings, for example, who they were burying in these great big, with all this stuff, maybe you wouldn't expect that to be accumulated there. So
Okay.
there's a kind of a skewing of archaeology, is what I'm saying. So um, then also like South America is kind of interesting because they found um, basically a gold working tools kit, if you want to call it that, in like 1500 BC. But they didn't find any evidence of gold until 1,000 years later. So they know that there had to have been gold in 1500 BC there, but they're not finding it anywhere up until 500 BC. So there's obviously something going on where they're not. It's harder to find archaeologically in certain cultures.
Right. And do you think that's also because of just the nature of the climate and the location as well?
Well, I don't think they know. That's what I'm saying. They're like, well, we found this kit, but we can't find any gold. Well, they were obviously working it because they're finding the tools that work gold with. But they didn't find gold, and then they didn't. The earliest they found it is 1,000 years later. So, I guess what I'm saying is these things are not so easily. Gold is not so easily found as people think archaeologically in certain particular areas. Yes, where you've had a civilization that's stable over a long, long period of time. Yes, then you probably get accumulation of gold, and then you can find it. And if there was a lot of it available, but so I'm just saying that you can't just take the Greek culture and say, hey, we find gold in some of our excavations in Greece or the Romans and extrapolate that out to every culture that's out there, right? Um,
Okay.
so, and then I kind of, if you want to keep on going, I do show that uh, there are gold deposits, some placer deposits in the general area. Um, so that it could have been mined locally as opposed to, but I kind of put in bold. It says one thing that doesn't seem apparent from the text is while there are present in the Jaredite area, the text does not require large or lots of deposits, because it only mentions them in a couple of locations. So then if you want to just pop through the next, I just kind of show where there's some, at least current gold prospects in the Olmec area. I mean, it's all Mexico. That's just one particular company.
Okay.
Okay, let's
So
go to
these
the
are Olmec areas in Mexico that would have had gold deposits.
well, just down there just the two down in the isthmus. You can see Santa Marta, Arena. That's kind of over in the Zapotec, but actually the Olmec had influence over there too. So in Monte Alban. So, and again, these are just recent prospects, right? There may have been mined out gold area, that kind of thing. There was also some documentation, like in the 1800s when they went through, they found some low-grade placer deposits. It's not marked here because it's not really economic for them to mine under now's market, but the Olmec might have did it. That's what it says when they said they moved large heaps of earth. That may have been the kind of, it was basically, they had to move a lot of material to get a little bit of gold. And that's probably an indication that maybe it got mined out. They had to keep doing that. They had to move that much to get the gold that they had. That means it's probably a low grade deposit, probably.
Okay.
Okay.
So Nephite metals.
So, it's hard to talk about metals for 2 hours, but we're kind of doing it. It's not. The Ammon arms thing was much more fun to talk about.
Yeah. If I'm being honest, I don't find metals super interesting, but it's important to address. So let's dive into that. I'm hoping that we can get this done within the hour, because I have to go at about 8 o'clock. So
yeah, we can. So let's see how long we got. 45 minutes, or what is it?
Yeah, 45 minutes to an hour. I'll try not to interject too much so you can get through your presentation.
Yeah, I think we'll get through this next part fairly quickly because we've already kind of got the baseline, talked about, the archaeological. On Nephite metals, I'm just going to go chronologically because we've already kind of talked generally about each individual metal and the possibilities for them. One thing about it is we'll talk a little bit about the specific areas. Also, was the metal probably available, at least gold. We're mostly talking about gold because the other ones, it's like, would it survive? I don't know. In the archaeological record, probably not. So that's the main issue on anachronism. So one thing you need to recognize is that you do have gold working in Book of Mormon times up into Panama, fairly sophisticated gold work. And there is evidence of trade going from Mesoamerica to Panama at that time. Now, we don't find the gold up until later from Panama in the archaeological record, but it's certainly a possibility, meaning it could have been a trade item that came in. And I think the text will maybe indicate that's the case in certain situations. So Um, let's go to the next slide. We've kind of already talked about this. That's why we won't spend much time. But the naming of items in a new culture, the loan shifting, uh, the King James Bible, variability of steel, bronze, and brass. One thing we didn't address, let's go to the next slide. We talked about last time is there's these literary form anachronisms. Is they call them kennings. I didn't really think it was a kenning this because it uses the term gold and silver as meaning valuables. It's not necessarily meaning literally gold and silver. I called them parallelisms in a prior publication or couplet. Other people have published, they didn't reference me, interestingly enough, but I don't know why. They just didn't read my stuff, I guess. But basically, you have this term, gold, silver, precious things. It's really not, I'm not saying it's exclusive of gold and silver, but it doesn't necessarily have to mean there's gold and silver for that particular reference. And so so when we have those references, let's go to the next slide. These are the verses where that specific phrase is used. I'm not really going to assume that there was gold there because it looks to be a kenning. I mean, it's just meaning all their precious stuff, their valuables. Let's go to the next slide. One thing that would be unique about the Nephites that is not the same as in the Jaredites, if you want to pop to the next slide. Very good. There you go. So basically, Jewish burials are prohibited from containing metal. Nope, let's pop before the one before that.
Oh, sorry. I think we're out of sync here. There we go.
Yeah, if you want to go to the slide before that.
Jewish burials are prohibited?
Yeah. Yeah. From containing metal, right? So under the Genesis, under the law of Moses, you're not supposed to have anything that can't degrade and become back to the dust of the earth. And you can kind of look through that. Again, it's not that there's never been any gold found in Israel or anything, but it is kind of contrary to the religious cultural practice. And so if you're not putting gold, in a burial, where are you putting it? You're probably just recycling it or reusing it or something. So any questions about that?
No, so you're saying that this is found in Genesis, so this would have been what the Jaredites would have followed. So when it comes to gold,
Not the
oh, you're talking about the Nephites.
The Nephites. Yeah, we're now in we're talking about Nephite.
That's right.
Something unique to the Nephites is that they so again, this is made up. This is pretty much known. They don't even put like metal nails in there, I mean, so it's not just like some object. They don't want anything that can't return to the earth. Again, Genesis 3:19, for dust thou art, and for dust thou shalt return. Right? It's kind of off of that principle.
So Israelites would have followed
the next two we talked
that verse. I've never noticed that. I've never heard of that before. So they wouldn't want anything.
Well, that was the Jew. I don't know why they wouldn't. That was the practice, that they followed at the time. This is not anything I've come up with. This is just known. I mean, this is all just quoting from somebody else talking about ancient Jewish burial practices.
Oh, okay. I didn't know this.
So, yeah. So what I'm saying is, again, it's is there a reason you might not find them, buried with it? Like that's typically how they find gold, especially Mesoamerica. It's either in a tomb or it's, cenote, where they were throwing people to kill them, and then they throw in these gold items as part of their offerings, right? So And the next thing we talked about last time, but I just wanted to bring it up again in the context of, if you want to flip to the next slide,
Yep.
is whenever people talk about head plates and breastplates, again, assume it's metal. But if you can get to the next slide, basically they had plates made of shells that they wore helmets of. So just because it's a hard surface doesn't necessarily, they call it a plate, doesn't mean it's metal, right? Just because you have something called a plate, you just don't jump to, oh, that must mean a metal, right? That's some critics talk about that.
Could it also
And
be like
probably
wood
they
as
do
well?
in the same, yeah, or just like cotton, hardened cotton is what they would use. It's hard to penetrate, just compacted cotton. I get why some people think that because it does say copper, some breastplates made of copper or brass, but that's where I keep saying that you can't. When they're calling it that, it's maybe because that is not the norm, meaning it's some special item. It's not what the standard warriors were wearing as their breastplates, was some Olmec divinatory plate reserved for kings to wear. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. So it may not be the head place that we're imagining like the Roman soldiers used to wear, made out of pure metal.
Yeah. The Teotihuacanos had shells. They were made of ocean shells. They would made their head plates is what they call it. They call them platelets. So it's made of little platelets. Okay, let's go. The next one is just kind of trying to show that we do have metallurgical knowledge way back south of Mesoamerica, way beyond Jaredite times even. So it goes way back. So if we're looking at a potential trade item, uh, there is that possibility, right? So there's kind of two, as I mentioned, you can either be mining it yourself and doing something with it, or you can trade it in. So let's go to the next slide. And we talked a little bit about this, is when the first mention is around 585 BC, just guessing when they arrived. But it says they found all manner of ore, both of gold, silver, and copper. It's like, well, maybe what they stumbled across it perhaps, but if you go to the next slide, this kind of shows the ocean current, and then you can get the winds following this and El Nino events where they land somewhere. Initial landing may have been Colombia, Ecuador, even up towards Panama, perhaps. And there was all those metals were available during the Book of Mormon time frames. You want to flip to the next.
Okay, so you're not reading that as where they first settle in, Highland, Guatemala, but you're referring this could be further south where they first land.
Well, that's when they landed, and then they journeyed to the land of first inheritance. That was not Guatemala even. So that's where that was mentioned. So you have to look at it chronologically, right? So they're coming in, they first land, and then they journey in the wilderness to the land of first inheritance, right? Um, and so I'm just saying that there's really no, based on where you'd expect them to land based on the current, and then the winds go that direction too in El Nino years. So that's probably what you're looking at. They weren't fighting the winds. The winds shift there at the equator, and so that's the likely place you would have expected them. I mean, they could have gone further north, followed currents and landed up near Mesoamerica. But I'm saying right where they came out, it would make sense that they saw land, they landed instead of bouncing along the coast initially. And let's go through the next. This slide shows a culture that had metals. The shaven culture, the next slide. So we had cultures all up and down there, even up into Panama, that had metallurgy, had gold, silver, copper that would be available. So I'm just saying that initial reference is not an anachronism. I don't see it in any way. So then pop through the next slide. Again, I'm saying there's no anachronism. Go to the next slide. Then it talks about them going to the land of first inheritance. So they journeyed for many days. We don't really know where that was. We know that the land of Nephi, at least on the Mesoamerican models, is up in Valley of Guatemala, Guatemala City, but it could have been anywhere along this coast. Uh, there's no metals mentioned there at all anyway. So land of first inheritance, you don't really see any contradictions there. Go to the next slide. Then we'll start talking about the land of Nephi. The next location where metals are mentioned is land of Nephi. Mesoamerican models have it up in Valley of Guatemala. So around 565 BC, Nephi indicates iron, copper, gold, silver, brass, and steel were worked. There's no mention of mining or smelting at that time, just that they were worked. Population, again, we're talking maybe a couple hundred people. So archaeologically, what are you going to find? That it's kind of like what they're looking for Viking stuff on the eastern coast. They kind of know where they were at. They're still having they found one, but after searching for 40 years, they found a Viking site, in Nova Scotia, where they worked some iron. But so then a little bit later, 545, you have Jacob indicating that the small Nephi group was searching for gold and silver or precious ores and indicated they were finding success. So that's some indication that there was some gold in that area, right?
In this area of Highland
Jerem,
Guatemala.
again, that's 380. Yeah, and then you have Jerem 1:8 says that they had exceeding gold and silver. That's interesting. Copper, brass, and steel, but he doesn't seem to be able to know how to make plates. The gold plates that Nephi had made out of it. So that's around 385. So we're saying land of Nephi does seem to indicate that they probably had some local gold deposits that they were looking at. They weren't that far from Panama,
ore
so
deposits maybe as well.
But yeah, let's go to the next page. This is kind of busy. You get to that next slide. Yeah. So these are a bunch of deposits just shown on this kind of a metals mining map. Digging. So yeah, if you go one before that, it does show. I list on the bottom the ones that are copper, silver, and iron deposits. There are deposits in that area. That slide you're showing has two gold. So here on the bottom I list the copper deposits. So not every one of those deposits is those. I just pick out the one. I've looked at each one, and so those are the ones that have copper, silver, or iron.
Okay, and is this around the area of Highland Guatemala?
Yeah, if you look close, I probably didn't label it correctly, but over there on the far left, you can see Lake Atitlan.
Oh yes,
and then so you have Ciudad de Guatemala just straight over from that. That's Guatemala City. So and we don't really know how extensive land, and they were there a long time, so they probably did explore and look around the area, right? They weren't just passing through. Gold deposit, same thing. I kind of show you where Guatemala City is there in the valley. I mean, one of the problems with Guatemala City, is the whole. I don't know if you've ever been there, but they've got like a little archaeological site, but the city covers everything. So you can't even do archaeology there. So there's who knows what's underneath that whole city, right? And so that's the unfortunate thing. Is sometimes where you want to do archaeology, there's people living there.
Living people.
I know archaeologists hate that, but yeah. So I'm basically saying there's evidence that there was gold there, as the text kind of indicates. So it's not inconsistent with that. Again, they haven't found the gold there yet, but okay, go to the next slide.
But they know that there was deposits there, so the metal was there. They just don't find evidence that the metal was being worked.
Right. I mean, these are not necessarily ancient deposits. These are not just known gold deposits that are there or prospects that they have identified gold at. That's part of the problem is, well, we're not necessarily going to find the actual mine sites up in the jungle. Um, and they may have been reworked by the Spanish or something. What I'm saying is we don't really have a knowledge of what the Spanish did or didn't do completely in all of their mining that they did or extraction. They were interested in it. So even when it was Spanish territory, you know. So okay, I want to go to the next slide. Just going down chronologically, you have around 158 BC, King Noah laid the tax on 1/5 of his small kingdom of gold, silver, ziph, copper. Then he used it for ornamenting his buildings. Again, there's no mention of mining here or high smelt metallurgy. There may have been some alloying or gilding because it mentioned ziph, but it could also basically saying area was a known trade area. Community was a kind of a center point of trade during that period of time. And so it's not unlikely that it could have come in as a trade item as well. So I'm basically saying it was either available from um, trade or from locally. Again, land of Nephi tends to have it. So then you have 130, 125 has reference to gold because the Lamanites interesting half of their gold. So I'm just saying, it seems like the gold was getting plundered pretty well during that period, either from Noah or from the Lamanites. So,
Hmm.
okay, so then let's go to the land of Zarahemla. So, summary there is you do have availability of gold either locally or it was a trade area, so possibly trade. Land of Zarahemla again, will show that there's really no mining or production of gold indicated, so it could just be exclusively a trade item coming into the land of Zarahemla. Around 138 BC, Amalekite indicated he couldn't add to the small plates, right? So it's consistent with there not being much available local. Alma chapter 11 gives you this commodity exchange system, right? Where it lists all the C9s and Esroms and all that. People misinterpret that thinking that's the money. Like they had all this gold or silver or money. It's their commodity exchange system. It's taking the base exchange item, which is grain, and comparing it to people that had this particular commodity, whether it's silver or gold, what that would have been equivalent to. That does not mean that people had that much of it. It just means that was a commodity that was out there. In fact, it indicates that the judges were paid with gold and silver. And, Zan was trying to bribe with silver. So it seems to be just an elite item. We're not expecting gold and silver in marketplace. Gold dust spread all over marketplaces in in Highland Guatemala. That's not what it's talking. That's not what's being described. So, interpretation, and the church made the mistake of putting, saying that it was coinage or something, and when
Right,
they
in the
put it
chapter heading.
on it. Yeah, so I'm not saying this is all anti-X. It's like, well, the LDS people have been making this mistake, not really reading it, right? And so, um, in fact, the fact that he even had to lay it out maybe has indicated that wasn't very well known. Meaning those commodities were not well known among the population. They were not trading in gold or silver. They were just trading in corn and for cocoa beans or whatever it was. They go to the markets. Actually, in the Aztec markets, they would have these little um, trays really that were divided up into different sizes of volumes, and that's the way they would trade. They would put the corn in there and say, okay, here's this much corn, and what are you trading for it? Put it in there, and so so they were using volumetric measurements to exchange their commodities. There was really no money. There was elites that used cocoa. If they're traveling far, they cocoa beans, cacao were valued everywhere. So they would often just bring bags of that. So you call that. Some people say, well, that's equivalent to money. It's still not. It's not a standardized exchange of bills or coinage, or it's still a commodity exchange. Okay, let's go to the next. So again, that's not indicating that necessarily was a lot. On the next slide, there really isn't much. You have Tuxtla Gutierrez, that's kind of your um, area, and then they've got kind of that long little lake south of it. It's kind of there to be. There is one silver mine to the north that has gold in it, so there is possibly that there was some local gold, but it looks to be a trade item. Um, go to the next. We should be through this pretty quick, so go to the next slide. The land of Antionum, which is east of Zarahemla, indicates they had ornaments of gold worn by the Zoramites. Um, there's also this little short section, it's kind of interesting, where it talks about the land north and land south. It's not really clear where those boundaries were. It was during a period of peace when the Lamanites and the done all this missionary work, Nephi of the Nephi Lehi guys, and it looks like they're probably drawing land north boundary, probably Zarahemla. Land south would be south of Zarahemla. It seems to be something that they created when they were friends, right? There was some combined uh, political alliance. But it's interesting because it indicates that at that period of time, they had a lot of gold and silver, at least in their minds. But it was during a period of free business intercourse between the Lamanites and Nephites. So it looks like probably Zarahemla, maybe they were getting it from land of Nephi, right? During this time, the Lamanites were friendly and trading with them. So it probably is indicating Zarahemla doesn't necessarily indicate Zarahemla had a lot of gold. So, and then go to the next slide. We have kind of an undetermined area where it just talks about the Gadiantans were trafficking in gold and silver, again, indicating it's a trade item. So when it comes to gold, let's go to the summary. Um, so gold at first arrival by the Lehites has no anachronistic elements. We showed that. No gold mentioned in the land of first inheritance. Again, recognize we haven't found gold. There's some gold to be indicated to be present in the land of Nephi. There's no requirement for gold mining in the Book of Mormon after 545 BC. Again, this is kind of getting towards what we might want to look for archaeologically. Sometime between Nephi and Jerem seems like some technology of metalworking was lost. And the land of Zarahemla doesn't indicate there's necessarily any mining gold. They were working it, but it seems to be a trade item. So kind of narrowing in on what you'd call the gold anachronism, right? It's kind of saying, okay, what would we expect to find based on the Book of Mormon text? And really, we've already established there's gold present land in Nephi, so that's not an anachronism. There seems to be some availability land of Zarahemla, although I don't think that's what it looks to be, mostly a trade item. So probably in the future, the archaeology can both look for number one, seeing if they find gold. They're actually not digging in most of these areas, unfortunately. Most of the stuff is outside of Book of Mormon area, down in the Yucatan with all the temples and the Maya stuff. So there's really not much happening either in the Olmec area or up in where land of Zarahemla would be, or
In
even
terms of
land
like
of Nephi,
new
because it's all covered
excavation,
by the city.
new
So
discoveries.
yeah, yeah, right. So I mean, honestly, if you go up into the Chiapas, the Highland Chiapas, the last one's digging. Some of the areas, the last one dig there was the New World Archaeological Foundation, the 60s and 70s.
Oh wow.
So it's just not that there has been, there was some excavation by BYU in Chapati Corzo or Chapati Corzo, but and they did find a kind of an Olmec, things buried, what looks like weapons in a certain pattern, kind of matching, the way they said they buried their weapons of war for peace, that kind of thing. But what I'm saying is, it's like, well, people say, hey, they're not finding any. It's like, well, number one, I don't think there's really not that much archaeology going on in the areas where Book of Mormon took place. And it's kind of like land of Nephi. How many people are really there? Uh, Gold is being discussed. What are the populations? It may be only a very small area. Uh, so it's not, I mean, if you said, hey, in Ireland, we know a family landed somewhere on the way. They traveled a bunch of days. Could you find where they lived? I mean, even in America, we have what's Jamestown. You know, when they know there were these early settlements on the coast and the East Coast, they've been looking for them for years. They kind of finally found some, but then they said, well, they all died there. But now they're finding evidence that they actually went inland. And this is being looked for hundreds of years to try to find this location. And they actually knew kind of where it was supposed to be. So for us to go and say, oh, we're going to go find the land of first inheritance where there's a small population, or even early Jaredite stuff where they were only at 150 people, maybe, 2000 BC. It's not realistic to assume you're going to find that. That would just be total luck. So I'm kind of saying that some of these things you have to look at and say, well, archaeologically, they're probably not necessary. I wouldn't expect them to find any early gold. You might have a period where they talk about them having gold in both Zarahemla. So maybe in that chronological layer, you might, again, after the destruction, it doesn't seem like they were probably trading all type of culture, right? They were peaceful, following, they weren't trying to enrich themselves. In fact, that's what when they start getting silver and gold, that's when they become set on that, and they're getting ripe for destruction, right? So, which is mentioned at the end of Fourth Nephi. That's what's happened. So you have like a 300-year period. Would we expect to find anything in that area? I don't think so. Not from what the Book of Mormon text indicates. So you kind of have to say, okay, it's got to be during this time frame in this general location. That's kind of a hard ask to have send an archaeologist out there to find it.
Yeah, sort of like
That's
the
difficult.
limitations of
So
what
I think
archaeology
my
can
point of
find
view
as
on
well, especially if it's not widespread. And, as you said, like when the Nephites in their first land of inheritance, this wouldn't have been a big population at this stage or a massive area they would have been inhabiting.
yeah, and you tell them, well, it can be anywhere from Guatemala all the way to Panama, somewhere along the coast. Go find it. Go find the one little river or stream that they live by. Just that'd be impossible, right? So we can't even do it now when we know we have records saying the town is somewhere right here. They have a hard time finding it buried, So I think when I'm looking at, in my opinion, really the only remaining what I would call anachronism is the gold. Everything else I don't think you'd expect necessarily to find. And I think there are reasonable explanations of things that they do have found. Uh, Again, though, the question is how much gold was there? Really, what time frames would you expect it, archaeologically? And then where, to what extent? And so, yes, I would say it's still an anachronism in the sense that we haven't found the gold. The gold was clearly available, either as a trade item to the south or could be mined locally. So that's not an issue. It's not like they're in some area where there's no gold. So the question is, well, okay, yeah, it remains. But I didn't want to go to the next slide. And here's kind of the way I think things are going. So far, you do have some Tumbaga found before 8500 in Belize. It's a little Tumbaga bead, claw-shaped bead. The stylistic of it indicates it came from Panama. So you do have a trade item. It's getting to the time frame, and this was back in 64. So you do have a find that's getting closer to Mormon Moroni time frame. So we do show that there is trade coming up. So I guess what I'm saying is going further, back and further in time, looking at this gold anachronism, I do think probably eventually they will probably find some gold that they're digging in the right place that pushes it further back than 500 AD, right? So it will probably remain as an anachronism technically for some time because they're not really digging in the areas that they need to, I would expect. But perhaps they'll find more gold in other places in Mesoamerica. I don't know. It's not indicated that the Maya really cared that much about gold, like the Yucatan Maya because they do think it was available to them because they were trading down there, but they just didn't care much about it till later. So, and even in Western Mexico, most of that they think came up from South America. There was like a group that migrated up from South America. Yes, they may have brought the technology with them, but it may just be that they thought it, because gold isn't really a practical thing. It's just ornamentation and cool looking shiny stuff, right? It's not utility. To mine it and refine it is not, it doesn't provide utility to the culture
Hmm.
or to the population. So it's not, does that make sense? So it's really just an elite. It's like Quetzal feathers, that the elite wanted, but you didn't find the normal farmers walking around with Quetzal feathers in their behind their ear or something.
Not very useful.
So yeah. So if you want
Okay.
to just go to the next, just kind of gives people my. I've got other electronic books up. Go to the next slide and find the last slide. These are all free to download. You can go to my website, which is the next slide. I don't have any of this up that we've talked about, but at some point I will prepare a paper or something.
Okay. So basically, in a nutshell, your thesis when it comes to a lot of the metals in the Book of Mormon is, one, they weren't widespread. It could possibly be a loan, but your main argument is that archaeologically we just may not, we haven't discovered it yet, and the archaeology needs to basically catch up.
Well, I think kind of what I'm saying is I look the ones that Matt Roper says will haven't been found. I guess I wouldn't expect to find copper really. I mean, in that environment, it wouldn't be graded and corroded. I mean, some of these they're claiming they're anachronism. I'm like saying, well, the science would indicate you're going to find it anyway, right? In the nature of the soils and all that, it'd be very rare if you did. So, with the exception of gold, that's the one that you would say, okay, that might be, you might be expected to find that based on what the Book of Mormon says in an archaeological setting of some form, right? But again, it's still you still have to look at that and say, when are you looking for it, and where, and then I don't think that you necessarily need to find evidence of smelting or mining. It could have been a trade item. Does that make sense? So if and right now we found, there is a piece from Panama. The earliest piece up there is from Panama. So you may actually be looking. So if you're looking archaeologically, you don't find mine, smelter sites or mine sites. Well, that doesn't mean that the Book of Mormon. That's not a contradiction. It's really just the gold. The presence of gold is only an act. That, but the right time period.
And
The Book
I
of
know
Mormon would
whenever I
indicate
did,
that it doesn't seem like they're going.
oh sorry, yeah, your connection's going a wee bit here, Jared. Hopefully you can hold on here for the last couple of minutes. I know whenever I did an episode on
Oh,
anachronisms in metallurgy, um, John Sorenson quoted that he believed he found lots of, examples of metals in ancient Mesoamerica, but he felt that archaeologists wouldn't have supported his findings. What do you make of that claim from Sorenson?
I think those are still valid claims. I guess the question is are we finding still that still? I don't know. Um, no, as I'm saying, those what Sorensen's saying is a little bit contrary to what the archaeologists have said, right? So
Yeah.
they're just discounting it's not metal. So I just take them at their word. They're still looking at it.
Are they discounting the
Gold is
dating
really the
of
only
it?
thing that is of issue. I think, yeah, they would say, well, that's late, right? We found metal; it's got to be later, so because it's not known that early. It's kind of the self-fulfilling prophecy kind of problem. That on some dig sites. I'm not saying it did. I don't really, I know Sorensen's material. I haven't dug into every single reference there. That he did say there's like a little copper piece on the top of a temple or something. That might be true, and um, so I do agree that he did raise the issue of linguistically, there does appear to be words for metals way back if you look at the proto kind of languages. So
That's what I was going to ask you next,
linguistically,
because if they had
there's
a word
they
for
maybe
metal,
have
that would then imply that
right
there probably was metals around if they had a word for it in part of their language.
exactly. And I don't get into that because that's not new material. That's kind of I'm kind of in this one I'm just trying to give you kind of new material that I don't think has been out there related to those the issue on anachronism. That's why I'm not repeating all of Matt Roper stuff and we're reciting some of that. He doesn't talk about the languages too. So yeah, so I do think evidence, right? Have we found it exactly in the right place, exactly the right time? No, but I'm not really sure they've really excavated everywhere where they need to find it. Or, like I said, it wasn't really a practice. There may be reasons we don't find it because it's not really buried as part of burials under the Nephite culture. It's not, it's not, it's really an elite item. So if you don't have kings and temples for the kings, you know, burying them with all goods and elite, I'm not sure you would really find that. Metals, there's a lot of situations where they're gone. They're not present where you would expect them. So,
Well, I'll just ask one or two last questions or one or two last points, and then we'll wrap up. One point I wanted to make was, you know, you've outlined that many of these anachronisms among the Jaredites, or especially the Nephite animals or plants, and even maybe some of them else, could be likely a lone shifting anachronism, or in some cases it could just be that archaeologically we maybe shouldn't expect to find it, or we could still find it, with future discoveries as well. So some of these may not be definitive anachronisms. What would you say to a skeptic or critically thinking person watching this who says that you could come up with a bunch of different explanations for you know a text that has anachronisms in it as a way to try to dissolve or muddy it, like, and what if they said that the fact that there's still many outstanding anachronisms still sort of would support the case against the Book of Mormon? What do you think about that?
like I said, I don't really see any of these other anachronisms really. Again, my research is, I think the loan shifting is correct. So things like horses and that, elephants, I kind of gave you an explanation of that. So,
Right.
so I'm just looking at the text and the way naming happened anciently among new groups. The Book of Mormon is not inconsistent with that. In fact, it's very consistent with it. It's consistent with what you'd expect, which I'm not sure was really understood at the time the Book of Mormon was came forth. So I would agree that there is you probably based on the text you would expect gold in certain situations being in the culture. Now, whether you can find it, whether you're looking in the right place, that's a whole other question. Whether there's been sufficient excavation of all the areas where, like land of Zarahemla, for example, land of Nephi. I mean, I can just tell you they haven't excavated that much in those areas, and there doesn't seem to be much interest or activity up in those areas right now. Again, archaeology is driven by money. So you either have to have grants or you have to have some tourist reason. When the government spends money in Mexico for archaeology, yeah, there's some just scientific, but a lot of it's just trying to develop sites that tourists will go to because it makes money for them. So I guess from the skeptic standpoint, it's like, well, yeah, you can. I really don't see, other than gold being a partial anachronism, I don't really find much else that really isn't fairly easily explainable. Um, you can talk horses. I already talked about my approach there, and it seems to make sense. Now, they say, well, that's stretching. It's like, well, the reality is the Book of Mormon doesn't provide a ton of information on these areas. So you only have a few things mentioned in a few places. So we don't have a complete history. We don't, um, even though we generally think we know where Lana Zarahemla is, well, we don't know where every city perhaps was there. And there's all kinds of sites all over the place that have just been reconnaissance. They've gone out, oh, there's some mounds here, but never excavated them. All over the place, Tabasco and Highland Guatemala. Some have been plowed under, like Ammonaya, that El Mirador. That was a site, that was excavated in the 50s, 60s. As you go there now, it's just there's a few mounds, but it's mostly been laser leveled farming, so they're gone. And there's a big greenhouse over part of it. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm not like super optimistic that, oh yeah, there's all this excavation going on, and sometime they're going to turn something up. I don't think it'll happen in my lifetime. I
And
mean,
one
I'm
thing that really
62,
surprised
but
me, like, because whenever I was in my faith crisis and left the church, and you learn about these anachronisms, you kind of assume that like everything has been archaeologically excavated and just nothing's been found. It's like, okay, those things didn't exist. And I think like you're providing some possible or even some plausible explanations for some of these anachronisms, being open to okay, the possibility of ancient people and some ancient texts. There could be loan shifting, or if this is a translation, some translators could also insert an anachronism. I think the reference to the steel bow is a really plausible example of this being a translator's anachronism, but the steel bow being likely the bronze or the brass covered bow. So I see that as quite plausible, and I think as well, like if we've excavated, less than 1% of Mesoamerica, doesn't mean we definitely will find these things, but I don't think we should say we definitely won't. And as you said, like there's not been a ton of new excavations done in recent decades. I think the door is still open, and I also think when it comes to anachronisms, like I do see the critics' argument when it comes to anachronisms, but I think you also need to take into account the correspondences or the things that converge well with the text of the Book of Mormon. And I think you've done lots of research into this. Obviously, John Sorenson and Brant Gardner. I think there's things that converge quite well with Mayan culture, particularly I think the warfare in Mesoamerica. Your work on the geology corresponds quite well. So I think you need to take those things into account as well that seem to correspond well. And the limitations of like the Nephites would have lived among the pre-classic period, and it seems that most of the excavation that's been done has been of the classic Maya and their cities and civilizations. So there's maybe some limitations as well.
yeah, and I think what I'm saying is the Sorensen model and all that, the Maya aren't really down there, aren't really part of the model. That's yes, the Lamanites had that culture, but they were local Lamanites adjacent. The Nephites were a smaller group in a much more limited area, and even then, culturally, they were wicked half the time, so they weren't. Are you going to find like Hebrew stuff? No. So what I'm saying is, I mean, I do agree. I mean, some people like sheep, for example. There's been a lot of argument. Well, they found some sheep. I've made, some isolated. I'm kind of like, well, even with the excavation that they've currently done, even though it's 1 to 2%, I probably would have expected them to find a sheep bone of some sort if it was a standard domesticated old world sheep. Um, Not talking Jaredite stuff because that was limited, and they said all their animals died. I'm talking Nephite, and so that's why I think the evidence is indicated it's a lone shift, right? Even Brian Stubbs' work, he has like the term for deer in the Indo-Aztecan is a female sheep because it comes from a Hebrew word for female sheep. So it seems like they were using white-tailed deer probably as their substitute for sheep. That's what they used. They had to adapt when they came. So what I'm saying is some people are looking for these anachronisms, trying to find stuff archaeologically. I would say some of those, I think that's not what's really good. That's not what's being talked about in the Book of Mormon.
Mm.
If some of them are clearly lone shift, and so you can go keep looking for those, and it's fine. But I don't think you're going to find. I think even in 30 years, but the lone shift. Now, gold is a little different, right? Seems to be that they're talking about we have gold plates, and so I would say, yeah, the gold probably I would say is not a lone shift really. I think brass could be, because that was in the Bible. The steel, the Bible has copper, gold. I mean, the word for steel in the Bible could mean anything. So, so my point of view on anachronisms is I think most of them, I really only see gold as the remaining one that exists. Book of Mormon, I don't see any Book of Mormon anachronisms that don't find reasonable explanation um, with either loan shifting or they found it already. So I'm not seeing it, right. But that's, again, I have kind of my own research, and I kind of show populations are a lot less than people are saying. Um, they're looking for millions, right term for millions. Well, the Reformed Egyptian, that word could just mean multitude, many. It could mean million. So it's not like they were counting them exactly. So even population numbers, it's their interpretation of the Book of Mormon, right? That's really at risk. It's the same thing when they say, "Oh, 100th of this record," so there's going to be 100 times the record. It's like that's just a literary term. So again, the critics will try to take the interpretation that is most beneficial to them. They argue that the apologists do that too, and I'm not saying some don't, but I try to approach it just what does the text say? What do ancient texts say? What does the proof on the ground say? What does the archaeology say? And when I approach anachronisms, and the way I look at it, I think we're the only one I think is kind of gold. Um, not that it wasn't there in terms of being able to be mined. It was just we don't find evidence yet in the archaeological record.
And often critics will say, like, loan shifting or the translator's anachronism is, it's mental gymnastics, or it's stretching, or it's a convenient way to try to explain away something that's anachronistic. I guess you're sort of arguing that, like, from more research I've done, I recognize that that is something that some ancient people and even ancient texts might have done some loan shifting as well. So you can't just say it's a ridiculous notion that something that ancient people did do. So it's very possible or even plausible it could have been done in some instances. So like you said, maybe some things wouldn't be archaeologically discovered, and that, yeah, it kind of makes it more complex in those regards. And I
Well,
think where this, oh, go ahead.
yeah, I'm just saying, actually, it's the norm, not the exception. Like I said, the Vikings did it. We found it. The Spanish did it, came in. It's like, well, anytime there's been somebody coming in the New World and encountering these different things, they've all loan shifted. They've all done loan shifting. They almost never have incorporated the actual name. Occasionally, like, you'll get some native word, but there were so many different native languages that which one were they going to pick, right? What tribe of Indian name for, horse or something. So I'm just saying, I think the evidence is that is the norm of encountering new cultures in the New World, that they did load shifting, the cultures that came in. So when they say that's just mental gymnastics, I'm saying that's good mental gymnastics, because the balance beam is what's used in the Olympics, right? so that is the norm. So if we're doing gymnastics on the balance beam, it's because that is what historically we see from these new cultures. So they can characterize it however they want. You just need to look at the data. That's what I do. Meaning I don't sit here and try to explain away stuff with crazy explanations. I look at the data. I look at the text itself. What does it really say? And what are people thinking it says? So, of course, I don't do my research according to it anyway. I just do research what I'm interested in. So,
Well, I appreciate this because I think it's important to address the topic of anachronisms. It's something that people have questions about, something that I have questions about as well. I think it remains still, a challenge against the Book of Mormon, but I think you've done some good research and provide some, possible interpretations or explanations. I'll also cite, what do you call him? Matt Roper, his article as well on metals as well. And like I said before, I think it's important as you're examining, the truth claims and the historicity of the Book of Mormon, that, yeah, you should examine and look at the arguments going against, and then what are some of the apologetic reconciliations or explanations to that. And then on the flip side, to try to take into account some of the evidence in support as well. Because if you don't acknowledge any of that, then I can understand why people may not be convinced or fully satisfied by apologetic answers to criticisms. If all you can see is criticisms and problems going against, and when you look at it both combined, it can make it more complicated, but I think it can provide a bit more of a case in favor for the Book of Mormon. And I guess the best theory or the best model is one that tries to explain all of the data. And there's always going to be some that's supporting and some that's going against, and people have to weigh up where they side. And actually, just one last thought I had in this past week. I don't know if I was listening to a video or if I read it somewhere, but it was Heber J. Grant at a general conference. He reported, I think when he was at university or somewhere, that some PhD student came up to him and attacked him for believing in the Book of Mormon because the Book of Mormon talked about cement. And like we know there never was cement in Mesoamerica. And you know that at the time, I think this would have been the early 1900s or late 1800s. This would have been an anachronism, and Heber J. Grant was just like, well, I believe in the Book of Mormon, and if we've not found cement, my children or my grandchildren, you know, in decades to come, will find it. And then, you know, they've now found cement in Mesoamerica, and if anything, it's probably more of an evidence that they found it in the place of Teotihuacan, which sort of matches Sorenson's description of the land northward. So I'm also open to more archaeological discoveries could be found, and what was once considered an anachronism and something against the Book of Mormon's authenticity and historicity. In the future, it could be discovered, but then again, it may not. Um, but yeah, those are my thoughts. And I think Matt Roper as well, he's shown over the last 200 years or so, there has been less anachronisms and more things discovered over time. So I think that needs to be taken into account as well. That yeah, there's still some outstanding anachronisms, but over the decades, there's been more things discovered that have attested to what the Book of Mormon claims.
Yeah, I think that's part of it is they're just some of the anachronisms are just interpretation anachronisms in different ways. So say this is an anachronism because they're interpreting the text that way. They don't care about ancient loan ship. They don't care about any of that stuff. Oh, if it says steel, that means those guys had to be, they were meant steel. They had I mean, I actually heard, I can't remember the Bill Real guy or something saying, well, didn't have blast furnaces and blah, blah. It's like, well, neither did the ancient Romans. That kind of process wasn't even invented for the Chinese in like 600 AD. So it's like, yeah, that's crazier than some for the say I what I academic guidelines, and so I don't, and I'm not just quoting LDS people all the time or whatever. It's just like, and if I acknowledge there's some puzzle, I work on it. It just is an interesting thing, but so far there's nothing. You know, a lot of you've talked about you had faith crisis. A lot of people have faith crisis. I have never really had what you call faith crisis, like with regard to the Book of Mormon. You know, sometimes I've been treated poorly by other members, things like that, but I've never really had any concern. And I'm a scientist, right? So I look at data. There's nothing I'm seeing that is really not consistent with what I'm finding. Understanding ancient texts and understanding the geology, understanding even the signs and wonders and the night of darkness and all these things, all explainable scientifically, and actually are kind of actually evidence of them. I mean, sometimes I watch some of these critics. There was one that did say the Book of Mormon is heliocentric, where the Hebrews believed in.
Jerry's not been able to get back on, but I'll just do a final sort of ends and closing statement. I do personally find anachronisms probably one of the most challenging arguments against the historicity of the Book of Mormon. And for me, I'm grateful for Jerry and his research, at least to confront and tackle each of these anachronisms. I think he's provided an interesting theory or explanation. It's one that I'm going to consider as well. And you know, staying open to the possible explanations of a translation anachronism or loan shifting of the ancient Nephite authors, which is something that we know ancient civilizations and peoples have done. And, with the example of what I said with Heber J. Grant and the claim of that PhD student that there's no evidence of cement, and then decades later, finding cement in Mesoamerica. And that's something for me that I still remain open that some of these things may be found as well. And I think it's just important to take into account the evidence in favor for the Book of Mormon. If I didn't see any correspondences or anything that converged in the Old World, in the New World, ancient names in the Book of Mormon, anything like that in support, I don't know if I would be satisfied by some of these apologetic reconciliations, but I totally can see where the critics come from and why people find anachronisms hard or a strong argument against the Book of Mormon. So that ends the three-part series with Jerry. I hope you've enjoyed this. Check out his books and his research. Give this video a like, share, comment as well. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on future interviews. If you care to donate to support me, PayPal, Patreon. I've also got a donor box, or no, it's not donor box, GoFundMe as well. You can do that. And I'll see you next time on Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye. Thanks everyone for watching this episode. If you've enjoyed it, please give it a like, share it with others who might benefit, and don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss any future content. You can also listen to these episodes on podcast form on Anchor or Spotify, and you can follow me on Facebook, Instagram, and TikTok. Check out my website for more content, personal blog, and more. And if you care to donate to support me, you can via my PayPal or Patreon or through the website. And you can also give donations via YouTube through Super Chats. Thanks for watching Mormonism with the Murph. Take care. Bye-bye.